Picture this. You're 12 years old. Right now, at 12, you're worried about a math test, or whether your voice is cracking in front of the whole class, or which skin you're going to unlock in whatever game everyone's playing this month. 12,000 years ago, at 12, you could already be married. You could already be pregnant. You could already be raising a kid of your own while your own mother watched from 3 feet away, half proud, half terrified. And before you close this tab and assume this is going to be some grim doom and gloom lecture about how awful the past was, stick with me, because the real answer is weirder, more logical, and honestly more darkly funny than you'd expect. This isn't a story about ancient people being reckless or ignorant. It's a story about biology playing a completely different game than the one we're playing today, with completely different rules, completely different stakes, and a completely different clock ticking in the background. So let's start with the myth everyone repeats. The one that sounds smart at a dinner party and is almost entirely wrong. People back then only lived to 30, so obviously they had to breed young. You've heard this. I've heard this. It's on every trivia app, every random Instagram infographic, every uncle at Thanksgiving who read one article once. And it's misleading in a way that completely distorts how you picture the past. Here's the trick hiding inside that statistic. Life expectancy at birth in ancient societies really was low, sometimes shockingly low, sometimes down around 30 years. But that number is an average, and averages get wrecked by extreme numbers sitting at one end. Imagine a room with 9 people who live to 70, and 1 baby who dies within its first year. Average that out, and the room's life expectancy collapses to around 63, even though 9 out of 10 people in that room lived long, full lives. Now scale that logic up. Ancient infant and child mortality was brutal. Something like a third to half of all children never made it to age 5. That single fact alone drags the average lifespan number down into the basement, even in populations where the adults who survived childhood routinely lived into their 50s, 60s, 70s, occasionally further. So the real picture isn't everyone died at 30. The real picture is an enormous number of people died as babies, and if you made it past childhood, your odds of a long life were actually pretty decent. Archaeologists have pulled skeletons out of Neanderthal sites and early Homo sapiens sites showing people who lived well into old age, with worn joints, healed fractures, and the kind of skeletal wear that only comes from decades of living. Grandparents existed. Grandparents mattered. There's an entire academic theory called the grandmother hypothesis built around the idea that older, post-reproductive women were so valuable to their communities, so essential for childcare and food gathering and survival knowledge, that evolution actively favored women living well past menopause. That's not a species that expected everyone to keel over at 30. That's a species that planned for old age as a feature, not a bug. So if it wasn't everybody died young, why on earth were 12-year-olds having kids? Before we even get to puberty, let's clear up one more piece of the picture, because childhood itself in the ancient world was an absolute minefield, and understanding just how dangerous it was explains a lot of the panic baked into these old systems. Infectious disease, dysentery, respiratory infections, complications from something as ordinary as a bad tooth, these things killed constantly, and they killed indiscriminately. There was no antibiotic waiting in a medicine cabinet. There was no emergency room. A scraped knee could, in genuinely unlucky circumstances, become a death sentence within a week. When you're raising children inside a system where roughly a third to half of them might not see their 5th birthday, every surviving child becomes an enormous, precious investment, and every extra year of fertility becomes another shot at keeping the family line going. That backdrop of constant, low-grade dread is honestly the missing context behind almost every decision ancient families made about marriage timing. Let's talk about puberty, because this is where things get interesting and where a lot of assumptions fall apart. Today, in wealthy, well-fed modern countries, the average age of first menstruation sits somewhere around 12 to 13. That number feels normal to us because it's the water we swim in. But here's the twist. That number is actually unusually early by historical standards, not late. Go back to 19th century Europe, before modern nutrition, before childhood vaccines, before reliable calorie surpluses, and the average age of first menstruation was closer to 15, 16, sometimes even 17 in poorer regions. Puberty isn't a fixed biological alarm clock. It's a calorie-triggered event. A body needs a certain threshold of stored fat and consistent nutrition before it decides reproduction is even a viable option. Starving bodies, stressed bodies, chronically malnourished bodies delay puberty because, biologically speaking, that's a smart move. Why start a pregnancy your body can't support? So, paradoxically, plenty of ancient and pre-industrial populations, especially ones living through lean seasons, food shortages, and inconsistent hunting and gathering, likely hit puberty later than that popular image of kids having kids at 10 suggests. 12 was rarely the average age of first pregnancy across the ancient world as a whole. It happened, and it happened more than would be acceptable today. But it wasn't the universal norm painted by a viral headline. It was closer to the early to mid-teens in many well-documented ancient societies, with actual childbearing often beginning a couple years after the onset of puberty itself, once the body had matured further. But closer to the early to mid-teens is still shockingly young by modern standards. So let's not pretend this is all a myth. It happened constantly across cultures, across continents, across thousands of years. So what was actually going on? Reason 1, mortality math forces urgency. Even if the everyone dies at 30 idea is oversimplified. Even with the corrected numbers, ancient life was still a gauntlet. Disease, famine, predators, violence, infection from something as small as a splinter. If you wanted your genetic line to survive, and evolution brutally only cares about genetic lines surviving, you couldn't afford to wait around. A woman who started having children in her mid-teens instead of her mid-20s could potentially have several more chances at successful births across her fertile years. Every extra reproductive cycle mattered when a huge chunk of children weren't going to make it to adulthood anyway. It's a horrifying kind of math, but it's math nonetheless. And evolution doesn't care about horrifying. Evolution cares about what works. Reason 2, fertility windows were treated as a scarce, urgent resource because they were. Without modern medicine, women faced serious risks throughout their entire reproductive years, not just in old age. Every pregnancy carried a real chance of death, from bleeding, infection, obstructed labor, or complications with absolutely zero modern intervention available. Waiting felt, and often was, like gambling with an already limited number of safe reproductive years. Communities that depended on population numbers for survival, more hands to farm, more hunters, more defenders, more caretakers for elders, had enormous pressure to maximize births within whatever window of safety existed. Reason 3, and this one surprises people. Economic incentive, not romantic love, drove the majority of early marriages. This is crucial. When you picture a 12-year-old getting married in the ancient world, your brain probably jumps straight to something disturbing and romantic coded, like a wedding scene. That's largely a modern lens layered onto something that functioned completely differently. In agrarian societies especially, marriage was a labor contract disguised as a family event. A daughter married off young meant one less mouth to feed at home and a new set of hands contributing to a different household's farm, herd, or trade. A young bride wasn't necessarily expected to become sexually active and pregnant the instant vows were said. In an enormous number of documented historical cases across Rome, medieval Europe, and beyond, marriages were formalized young for legal, financial, and inheritance reasons, while the actual consummation and childbearing was delayed until the girl was physically older, sometimes years later. Betrothal and marriage were legal and economic tools first, biological events second. Let's actually walk through a few specific cultures, because the variety here is honestly the most interesting part, and it completely destroys the idea that ancient people behaved as one single global block making one single global choice. In ancient Sparta, of all places, girls generally married later than most of their neighbors, often somewhere around 18. That surprises people, given Sparta's reputation as this brutal, extreme society. But Spartan culture specifically valued physical fitness and strength in mothers, believing that a more physically mature woman produced stronger children and survived childbirth more reliably. So even a society famous for pushing people to their physical limits looked at very young pregnancy and essentially said, "Not yet, let the body finish first." Ancient Egypt shows a similarly wide range depending on class and era. Some records suggest marriage and childbearing beginning in the early teens for certain periods, while other records, particularly from workers' villages where actual daily life was documented in surprising detail, suggest marriages happening later, closer to 16 through 20, once a young woman could reasonably manage a household. Egypt also had a notably practical view of marriage as a working partnership, with women holding property rights and legal standing that, frankly, plenty of societies thousands of years later still hadn't figured out. Medieval Europe is where the popular imagination usually goes wildest, picturing child brides everywhere you look, and reality is messier than that. Church law across much of medieval Christendom did technically permit marriage from around 12 for girls and 14 for boys, but historical demographers who've combed through parish records repeatedly find that the actual average age of first marriage for ordinary working women in medieval and early modern Europe was closer to the early 20s. Peasant families generally needed a daughter's labor at home for years longer, and needed a groom capable of financially supporting a household, which usually meant waiting until a young man had a trade, land, or savings. The child bride scenario was disproportionately a story of aristocratic and royal families arranging early political marriages, not the lived reality of the average farming village. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Meanwhile, across the Aztec world, records suggest marriage typically happened later still, often in the late teens for women and early 20s for men, with education and communal training expected beforehand. Different continent, different climate, different economic system, and yet another data point proving there was no single ancient template being followed. Roman law is a great, slightly cringeworthy example here. The legal minimum marriage age for girls in ancient Rome was technically 12. Technically, but historians who've dug through funerary inscriptions, family records, and demographic reconstructions have found that the actual average age of first marriage for Roman women, especially outside the elite aristocratic class, tended to cluster in the late teens, closer to 18 to 20. The legal floor of 12 existed, and it absolutely was used by wealthy elite families for strategic alliances, but it wasn't the lived reality of the average Roman girl grinding through daily life in the provinces. There's a massive gap between what the law technically allowed and what most people actually did, and that gap gets flattened into a single scary number every time this topic goes viral online. Reason 4, and honestly this one is the funniest and most human of the bunch. There was no concept of adolescence as we understand it. This is the part that blows people's minds. The idea of the teenager, a distinct life stage between childhood and adulthood defined by identity exploration, semi-independence, and delayed responsibility, is a shockingly recent invention. Historians generally trace the modern concept of the teenager to the 20th century, tied to things like mandatory schooling, child labor laws, and post-war consumer culture, creating an entire marketing category aimed at young people with free time and allowance money. Before that, the transition from child to adult was often abrupt and function-based. Could you work? Could you contribute? Could your body physically handle labor or childbirth? Then society, for better or worse, treated you as functionally adult, regardless of your actual number of birthdays. There was no in-between zone where you got to be moody, figure yourself out, and avoid responsibility for a decade. That entire cultural buffer we take for granted simply didn't exist for most of human history. Now let's zoom out even further, because this is where things get fascinating from a big picture evolutionary lens. Humans are, biologically speaking, kind of an outlier primate. Compare us to our closest relatives. Chimpanzees reach reproductive maturity and generally have offspring earlier relative to their total lifespan than humans do. Human childhood is unusually long and unusually expensive. Human babies are born ridiculously underdeveloped compared to almost any other mammal, largely because our skulls and brains are so large that pushing out a fully developed infant would be nearly impossible anatomically. So evolution made a trade. Humans give birth to essentially unfinished babies and then invest a massive, multi-year block of energy, protection, and teaching into finishing the job outside the womb. That's an enormous parental investment. It means every single human child is expensive, in calories, in time, in risk, which circles right back to why starting the reproductive clock early made evolutionary sense in a world without modern safety nets. More time meant more attempts at successfully raising a child to self-sufficiency, which, brutally, was never guaranteed. And here's the part that should make you feel a little more sympathetic toward your ancient ancestors instead of judging them from the comfort of your climate-controlled living room. A human child, unlike almost any other animal on the planet, needs roughly a decade and a half, sometimes 2 decades, of sustained feeding, teaching, and protection before it can reliably survive alone. Compare that to almost any other mammal, where independence arrives in months, sometimes weeks. That is an absurd, almost reckless amount of parental investment by evolutionary standards, and it only works as a survival strategy if enough adults are simultaneously raising children at any given time to share the load. Grandparents, older siblings, aunts, uncles, entire villages functionally co-parenting, because no single ancient couple could realistically shoulder that burden completely alone. Starting reproduction earlier wasn't just about beating the mortality clock, it was about maximizing the overlapping years where multiple generations could be actively present and helping raise the youngest members of the group at the same time. Let's talk food, because agriculture completely rewired this entire system. And not in the direction you'd assume. You might picture agriculture as the moment life got easier, more stable, more food, fewer worries. In some ways, sure, but archaeologists and anthropologists studying skeletal remains have found something counterintuitive. The shift from hunting and gathering to early farming actually made health worse for a long stretch of history. Early farmers relied heavily on a narrow range of crops, grains especially, which meant diets became less varied and less nutritionally complete than the broader, more diverse diet hunter-gatherers pieced together from hunting, fishing, and foraging dozens of different plant species. Skeletons from early agricultural societies show more evidence of malnutrition, more dental problems, more stunted growth, and shorter average height compared to their hunter-gatherer ancestors. Farming also meant settling down, which meant denser populations living closer together, which meant diseases could spread more easily, jumping between people and even between livestock and people for the first time in human history. So here's the twist. Agriculture, despite giving humanity food surpluses and eventually cities, actually may have delayed the average age of puberty in many populations for a while, thanks to worse nutrition, not sped it up. It's the opposite of what most people assume. At the exact same time, agriculture also created enormous new economic incentives for early marriage and childbearing because farms needed labor, families needed heirs, and land inheritance needed clear legal successors locked in as early as legally possible. So you get this strange collision, bodies maturing a bit later on average due to nutrition, colliding with social and legal systems pushing marriage and reproduction earlier due to economics. The result was a huge, messy range of ages across different cultures, classes, and time periods. Not one single universal number you could put on a t-shirt. There's also a wildly underrated character in this whole story, and that's the midwife. Every single ancient society, no exceptions found so far in the archaeological and anthropological record, developed some version of a specialized birth attendant. A woman, almost always a woman, whose entire job was managing pregnancy and delivery. This wasn't casual. Midwives accumulated sophisticated practical knowledge passed down across generations. Techniques for turning a breech baby, herbal preparations to manage bleeding, methods for cutting and tying umbilical cords to prevent infection. Communities weren't just throwing young girls into pregnancy and hoping for the best with zero support system. There was an entire invisible infrastructure of accumulated female expertise standing behind every single birth, doing everything humanly possible with the tools available to keep both mother and child alive. It just didn't come with a diploma or a hospital building attached to it, so history books mostly ignored it for centuries. Here's a fun curveball that anthropologists love bringing up at this point in the conversation, because it messes with the whole ancient equals hunter-gatherer equals earliest possible childbearing assumption. Researchers who've spent time studying modern hunter-gatherer groups like the Hadza in Tanzania or various groups in the Amazon, groups whose lifestyles are considered reasonably close analogs to ancient foraging societies, have generally found that first births tend to happen later than you'd expect, often not until the late teens or even early 20s. Foraging is physically demanding. It requires strength, endurance, and skill built up over years. A pregnancy or a new baby strapped to your back makes long-distance foraging and hunting dramatically harder, so there's an actual practical disincentive against very early motherhood in a lot of these mobile societies. It's usually the settled, agricultural, property-owning societies, the ones with land to inherit and labor-hungry farms to run, where you start seeing the real pressure toward earlier marriage and earlier childbearing show up in the record, which flips the popular assumption almost completely on its head. The stereotypical caveman-era child bride is, ironically, less supported by the actual anthropological data than the farmer's daughter married off for a dowry a few thousand years later. Let's bring in religion and law for a second, because these systems didn't invent early marriage, they mostly just formalized and regulated something that was already happening organically, sometimes to limit abuse, sometimes to enable it. Ancient legal codes, the Code of Hammurabi in Mesopotamia, various Jewish, Christian, and Islamic legal traditions all set specific ages and conditions around marriage and consummation. These weren't arbitrary numbers pulled from nowhere. They were often direct responses to existing social realities, attempting to create structure, inheritance clarity, and, in some documented cases, protections for young brides, like delaying consummation until physical maturity, requiring consent, or setting dowry and property rules meant to protect a young wife's economic security if her husband died. It's messy, culturally specific, and honestly varies wildly depending on which century and which region you're looking at. There's no single ancient rulebook everyone followed. There were thousands of overlapping local customs, and plenty of them contradicted each other completely. Here's something else worth sitting with. Risk. Pregnancy in a body that hasn't fully finished growing is dangerous, and ancient communities weren't blind to that. Skeletal evidence from numerous ancient burial sites shows disturbingly high rates of maternal death, particularly among younger mothers, alongside evidence of pelvic bone stress consistent with childbirth complications in bodies that were still developing. This wasn't some hidden secret modern science uncovered that ancient people never noticed. Communities absolutely observed this, which is part of why, in a lot of documented ancient societies, waiting for at least the mid-teens after the body had matured further past initial puberty was actually the more common and more encouraged practice, even in cultures where legal marriage happened earlier. The 12-year-old bride locked into childbirth immediately was a real thing that happened. And it was also, in a lot of documented historical contexts, considered risky and often actively delayed by families who understood the danger, even without modern medical vocabulary to explain why. Now, let's talk about something that rarely makes it into these conversations: choice, or the near total absence of it. It's worth being honest here instead of romanticizing the past. A 12, 14, or 16-year-old girl in most ancient and pre-industrial societies typically had extremely limited say in when or who she married. Patriarchal family structures, economic desperation, and social expectation did the deciding, not personal readiness or desire. This wasn't some empowered, informed choice made by confident young teenagers. It was, in the vast majority of documented cases, an arrangement made by parents, often for financial or political reasons, that the young woman had little to no power to refuse. Even the specific age chosen for a given marriage often had less to do with the girl herself and more to do with practical timing on the family's side. A harvest that needed extra hands, a debt that needed settling, a political alliance that needed sealing before a rival family got there first. The individual teenager in the middle of all this was frequently treated less like a person making a life decision and more like a resource being allocated at the moment it made the most economic sense for everyone else involved. Understanding the historical logic behind early marriage and childbearing doesn't require pretending it was some kind of golden age of bodily autonomy. It very much wasn't. So why does this matter to you? Scrolling through this video today, living in a world with contraception, prenatal care, and hopefully actual choices about your own life, because it reframes an entire chunk of human history from those people were just ignorant to those people were operating under a completely different set of pressures with completely different tools, completely different odds, and completely different definitions of what a normal life stage even looked like. It wasn't stupidity. It was a set of brutal trade-offs made by biology, economics, and survival, layered on top of each other for thousands of years, long before anyone had the luxury of thinking about adolescence as some protected, extended stage of self-discovery. Think about how strange that shift is for a second, because it's easy to take it for granted. For roughly 200,000 years of human existence, give or take, there was essentially no version of childhood the way you and I casually use the word today, stretching comfortably from birth all the way through the late teens with school, hobbies, and zero real economic responsibility attached. That entire concept is a blink of an eye old. Historically speaking, younger than the light bulb, younger than the airplane, arguably younger than your own grandparents in some parts of the world. And honestly, the fact that we now live in a world where 12-year-olds get to worry about math tests instead of childbirth is one of the single greatest, most underappreciated shifts in the entire span of human history. Modern nutrition, modern medicine, contraception, public education, child labor laws, all of it stacked together to build something unprecedented. An entire protected decade of human life where you're allowed to just grow, learn, and figure yourself out before anyone expects you to run a household or raise a child of your own. That's not the historical default. That's an incredibly rare, incredibly recent privilege, and it's easy to forget how strange and lucky that actually is when you're the one living inside it. Here's the part that should stick with you after this video ends. Every single ancestor standing behind you, all the way back through the family tree, every single one survived long enough and reproduced successfully enough, in conditions you and I can barely imagine, with mortality rates that would horrify any modern parent, with medical knowledge that amounted to guesswork and prayer, with legal systems that treated children as economic assets more often than not. And somehow, against odds that seem almost impossible from where you're sitting right now, that unbroken chain reached all the way down to you. 12 years old having kids wasn't some universal ancient norm plastered across every civilization. Equally, it was a messy, regionally specific, economically driven, biologically constrained reality that existed on a spectrum, more common in some eras and cultures, rarer and actively avoided in others, always tangled up with risk, always tangled up with survival math that most of us, thankfully, will never have to personally run. If there's one thing worth taking away from all of this, it's that history rarely hands you a clean, single answer, no matter how satisfying a short, viral headline makes it feel. The real answer is layered, contradictory, occasionally horrifying, occasionally strangely logical, and always more human than the simplified version. Ancient people weren't reckless, and they weren't stupid. They were making decisions inside a system that offered them a fraction of the safety, information, and choice you have access to right now, just by existing in this moment in history. So the next time someone at a party confidently tells you people used to just die at 30 so they had to have kids super young, you'll actually know the real, more complicated, more interesting story. You'll know about the grandmother hypothesis, about Roman legal minimums versus Roman lived reality, about Spartan mothers who married later than plenty of modern brides, about midwives quietly running the most important job in the ancient world with no formal title attached to it. Feel free to ruin the mood at that party. You're welcome. And if this kind of deep dive into the weird, uncomfortable, fascinating corners of human history is your thing, the kind of story that sounds simple on the surface and turns into an anthropology rabbit hole the moment you actually dig into it, you know exactly what to do next. Stick around because there's a lot more where this came from.